Welcome to the channel, and to everyone watching for the very first time, you are truly welcome. Tonight's story is not just another mystery. It is a question that has refused to disappear, a question that continues to echo in the minds of those who followed every detail surrounding the tragic final moments connected to Yu Meng Long. Because no matter how many times people revisit that night, one detail continues to stand out. Something that doesn't sit right. He was not alone. That much has been said, discussed, and repeated. There were others present, others who shared the same space, the same hours, the same atmosphere of that night. And yet, among all those who were there, only one voice broke through the silence. Only one person was heard in a moment of desperation. Only one person, according to what has circulated among discussions, seemed to be struggling in a way no one else was. And that raises the question that has left many unsettled. What really happened that night? Some stories fade with time, but this one has only grown stronger. Not because of what is known, but because of what remains unclear. People don't just remember the headlines. They remember the feeling that something didn't fully make sense. The timeline, the reactions, the fragments of information that seem to stop just short of answering the most important questions. Among those questions, one stands out in a way that is impossible to ignore. Was there something more? It's not a question built on proof. It's a question born from confusion, from curiosity, and from the unsettling nature of events that don't align the way people expect them to. Because when people revisit the idea that he was not alone, their thoughts naturally turn toward what that means. If others were present, if the environment was shared, then why did the experience seem so different for him? Why did the situation unfold in a way that appeared to affect only one person so severely? These are the kinds of questions that keep people searching, replaying every detail in their minds, trying to understand what might have been missed. There are those who believe the answer is simple, that everything that needed to be explained has already been explained. That sometimes tragedy happens without deeper meaning, without hidden layers. But there are others who feel that the story still holds pieces that have not been fully understood. Not necessarily hidden, but perhaps overlooked. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because when people talk about that night, they don't just talk about what happened, they talk about what was felt. The atmosphere, the tension, the sense that something about the situation didn't match the calm explanations that followed. Moments like these create lasting impressions. They leave people with questions that don't fade easily. Questions that return unexpectedly, long after the initial shock has passed. And in those moments, the mind begins to explore possibilities. Not conclusions, but possibilities. What if there was something in that environment that affected him differently? What if there was a factor that hasn't been fully understood or explained? What if the truth is not as simple as it first appeared? These are not answers. They are the reflections of people trying to make sense of something that felt incomplete. Because the human mind doesn't settle easily when something feels unresolved. The idea that he was the only one showing signs of distress, the only one reacting in a way that suggested something was wrong, continues to stand out. It becomes a focal point for discussion, for speculation, for the kind of curiosity that refuses to be silenced. And then there is the emotional side of it all. Yu Meng Long was not just a name in a headline. He was someone whose voice had reached people across different places, different backgrounds, different moments in their lives. His music wasn't just something people listened to, it was something they felt, something they carried with them. That's why stories like this don't simply fade away. Because for those who admired him, understanding what happened is not just about curiosity. It's about closure. It's about wanting to believe that every detail matters, that nothing important has been ignored. At the same time, it's important to remember that not every question has an answer that can be clearly seen. Some mysteries remain exactly that, mysteries. Not because the truth is being hidden, but because the truth itself may be more complex than it appears. Still, the question remains. Not as a statement, not as a claim, but as a thought that continues to exist in the minds of those who followed the story. Was there something more to that night than what has been understood? And if there was, will it ever truly be known? Sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones with clear endings, but the ones that leave us thinking long after they are told. The ones that remind us how much we don't always see, how much can exist just beyond what is immediately understood. This is one of those stories. And whether the answer is simple or complex, whether it brings clarity or raises even more questions, one thing remains certain. People are still searching, still thinking, still asking. Because when something doesn't feel complete, the search for understanding doesn't stop. Thank you to everyone watching. If you are here for the first time, you are welcome to a place where we explore stories that make you think, stories that challenge what we believe we know, and stories that stay with you long after they are told. If this story made you question, made you reflect, or made you feel something deeper, make sure you subscribe to the channel Midnight in Seoul and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. There are more mysteries, more questions, and more moments waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, the next story might bring you closer to understanding the one you just heard. Stay curious. The silence that followed that night did not feel ordinary. It wasn't the kind of silence that simply comes when something ends. It was heavier, almost as if it carried something unspoken within it. People who had been close to the situation began to notice it too, not immediately, but gradually, like a feeling that grows stronger the more you try to ignore it. Because when something truly ends, there is usually clarity, even if it is painful. But this felt incomplete. And that is what kept pulling people back. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks slowly blended into months, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of fading away, the questions surrounding that night seemed to deepen. Not louder, not chaotic, but quieter and more intense. Conversations shifted from public reactions to private reflections. People weren't just reacting anymore, they were thinking. And when people begin to think deeply about something that doesn't feel resolved, they start noticing details they may have overlooked before. Small things. Moments that didn't seem important at first. Reactions that felt slightly off. Timings that didn't fully align. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about understanding why something still didn't feel right. One particular detail kept returning in conversations. Not in a loud or aggressive way, but in a careful, almost hesitant tone. The idea that something about that night carried a sense of urgency that didn't match the calm explanations that followed. It was the kind of feeling you couldn't easily explain, but once you noticed it, it became difficult to ignore. People began revisiting the sequence of events, not to challenge them, but to understand them more clearly. They tried to imagine what the environment might have felt like in those moments. The atmosphere, the energy, the subtle shifts that happen when something is not quite as it should be. Because environments have a way of revealing truths that words sometimes cannot. And that's where the unease began to grow. If everything was normal, why did it not feel normal? If everything unfolded as expected, why did the emotional response from those who heard about it feel so different? These weren't accusations. They were instincts. And instincts, when shared by many people independently, begin to form a pattern that is hard to dismiss. For those who admired Yu Meng Long, the story was never just about what happened. It was about what was felt. His presence had always been associated with energy, life, and expression. There was something vibrant about the way he carried himself, something that connected with people beyond words. So when the story of that night emerged, the contrast was striking. Too striking. It felt like trying to fit two completely different realities together. And that disconnect is what made people question more. Not because they wanted to create mystery, but because the situation itself seemed to invite it. There were moments in the timeline that felt too quiet, too smooth, almost as if something had been simplified in a way that removed the complexity of what truly happened. And when complexity is removed from a situation that should naturally have it, people notice. They may not immediately understand what is missing, but they feel it. That feeling became the center of the story moving forward. It wasn't about proving a theory. It was about exploring that feeling. Because sometimes, the truth is not hidden in what is said, but in what feels absent. And absence can be just as powerful as presence. As time passed, more people began to approach the story differently. Instead of focusing on what they could confirm, they focused on what they could not ignore. The emotional weight, the unanswered questions, the sense that something about that night did not fully belong in the explanation that followed. It became less about finding a single answer and more about understanding why the question itself refused to disappear. Because most stories, even tragic ones, eventually settle. This one didn't. It lingered. It stayed. It returned in unexpected moments. Late at night, during quiet conversations, in the middle of unrelated discussions. It had a way of resurfacing, as if it was not ready to be forgotten. And perhaps that is what made it so powerful. Not what was known, but what refused to be resolved. People began to realize that sometimes, the most important part of a story is not the conclusion, but the tension that remains after everything is said. That tension becomes a space where thoughts grow, where questions form, where curiosity lives. And in that space, the story continues. Not in headlines, not in official statements, but in the minds of those who feel that something is still waiting to be understood. For many, remembering Yu Meng Long became more than just honoring his work. It became a reflection on how easily moments can change, how quickly clarity can turn into uncertainty, and how deeply a single unanswered question can affect the way a story is remembered. Because memory is not just about facts, it is about feeling. And the feeling attached to that night has never fully settled. It remains suspended between what is known and what is not, between what is accepted and what is questioned, between closure and curiosity. And that is where it continues to exist. Not as a conclusion, but as a presence. A quiet, persistent presence that reminds people that not every story ends in a way that feels complete. Some stories end with a pause instead of a period. And that pause is where everything lingers. Where every unanswered question continues to breathe. Where every detail continues to matter. Where every thought continues to return. And maybe that is what makes this story different. It does not demand answers. It invites reflection. It does not force conclusions. It allows questions to exist. And in doing so, it becomes something more than just a story. It becomes an experience. One that stays with you. One that makes you think. One that makes you feel. And sometimes, that is more powerful than any answer could ever be. Because answers end a story. But questions keep it alive. And as long as this story remains alive in the minds of those who remember it, it will continue to be explored, discussed, and felt in ways that go beyond simple understanding. Thank you for staying with this story, for allowing yourself to think, to feel, and to question. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself drawn to the mysteries that don't easily resolve, then you are exactly where you need to be. Make sure you subscribe to the channel Midnight in Seoul, turn on notifications, and continue this journey with us. There are more stories waiting. Stories that challenge, stories that reveal, and stories that may just change the way you see everything. Because sometimes, the truth is not found in what is revealed, but in what refuses to be forgotten.